All right, so let's talk about the boot process. Okay, we're going to get technical again. So all data and instructions, including the OS, are stored in RAM while your computer is on. We've established that, right? When you turn off your computer, RAM is wiped clean of all of its data because it's volatile storage or temporary storage. So how does a computer know what to do when you turn it on if there is nothing in RAM? Well, it runs through this special process called the boot process, or a startup process, to load the operating system into RAM. The term boot comes from Bootstrap Loader, which is just a little small program that's used to start a larger program. It actually alludes to the straps of leather called bootstraps that people used to use to help them pull on their boots. So if you've heard of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, okay, that's where we got the name boot process. Okay, so have a good look at this diagram here. This is just showing you the steps. There's 4 steps. Okay, we're going to cover all of these steps right now. Okay, so in the first step of the boot process, the CPU activates something called the BIOS, which stands for Basic Input-Output System. BIOS is a program that manages the exchange of data between the operating system and all of the input and output devices that are attached to the system. BIOS is also responsible for loading the operating system into RAM from its permanent location on the hard drive. BIOS itself is stored on a read-only memory chip. Okay, so it's stored in ROM, in the ROM. Okay, and unlike data stored in RAM, data stored in ROM is permanent and isn't erased when the power is turned off. See? Just think of those little boots when you think of the boot process. Okay, so second step is called performing the power on self-test. Okay, so the first job BIOS performs is to ensure that essential peripheral devices are attached and operational. A process called the power on self-test. Okay, sorry I had to take a pause there. I keep hearing some computer dinging noise, so hopefully you guys didn't hear it too. So yeah, the power on self-test, or POST, okay, if you want to think about it as POST, that should help you later, maybe for your exam, power on self-test. So this series of tests determines proper functioning of the RAM, of the disk drives, of the hard drives, of the CPU, and all other hardware devices. Okay, so this is a very important part of the boot process. So what the BIOS does is it compares the results of the power on self-test with the various hardware configurations that are permanently stored in this place called CMOS, okay, which is CMOS, just like you see on the slide. CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. So no, you're not going to have to remember that. It's just part of explaining how this step in the boot process works. And this little semiconductor is a special kind of memory that uses like almost no power at all. Okay, it actually runs on what looks like a watch battery. Okay, so those hardware configurations are permanently stored there in CMOS. Okay, CMOS contains information about the system's memory, the types of disk drives, and then other essential input and output hardware components. Okay. If the results of the first test, which was the power on self-test, match up with the hardware configurations that are stored in CMOS, the boot process continues on to step 3. All right. So I hope that's somewhat clear. If not, please let's talk about it in office hours or in a discussion post, okay? Ask me questions. I'm ready for your questions. All right, so step 3 is loading the operating system. Okay. So for this step, BIOS goes through this pre-configured list of devices in its search for the drive that contains what we call the system files, which are the main files of the OS. Once the system files are located, the operating system loads into RAM. Okay. Note that not the entire operating system is loaded into RAM, okay, because you don't need every single piece of the OS when you're initially just booting up your machine, okay? So other less critical parts of the OS stay on the hard drive where the OS is permanently stored, and then those are copied over as needed. So if they're not needed immediately, they're not copied over to RAM, okay? And then once those system files are loaded into RAM, something called a kernel, so note right here, like a popcorn kernel, not like military kernel, okay? The kernel is loaded, okay? And the kernel is this essential component of the OS. It's responsible for managing the processor and all other components of the computer system. So the kernel is one important piece of popcorn, okay? Kernel takes care of business, all right? So like I said, it's responsible for managing the processor and all components, okay? Once this kernel is loaded, the OS takes over control, right? So now the OS is in control of continuing on to step 4. Step 4 is checking further configurations and customizations. Okay, so finally, the OS checks the registry for the configuration of other system components. The registry contains all the different configurations or settings that are used by the OS and by other applications. It contains customized settings that you, as a user, have put into place. Things like which instructions you've given it as to which program should be loaded first. Things like mouse speed. Okay, if you didn't ever know, you can actually go in and choose your mouse speed. So these customized settings are now loaded. Okay. And then it's time for you to log in. Okay, this is the authentication piece right here. Okay, the verification of your login name and password is called authentication. So I'm sure you hear about authentication all the time. If you try and log into like your different like a credit card company website, for example, sometimes they do something called a two-factor authentication. So not only do you need your username and password, they also want to text you a code that you can enter in. So it's just a way of, making sure you are who you say you are. Okay. So again, here authentication is talking about the same thing. This authentication process blocks unauthorized users from entering the system. Okay. So all large networked environments like NMHU, for example, require user authentication for access. And you may or may not have a password on your personal machine. Okay. If you don't, obviously, you're going to be skipping this authentication part. But may I highly recommend that you please password protect your machine. Okay. So continuing on with step 4. If you happen to be using Windows 10, the default setting is to input a password to log into your Microsoft account. Okay. And so, believe me, I'm not a Microsoft pusher here, but our author of our textbook seems to be a big fan. Okay, which is fine. So I'm just letting you know, per the book, that the reason Microsoft has this as a default setting is basically because once you log into your Microsoft account, if you are using a different computer, for example, it's sort of it's going to preload again, the customized settings that you've chosen. Okay. And so even though this entire boot process took me like 10 minutes so far to describe to you, really, it only takes like maybe a minute to complete, okay? It really shouldn't take that long. If your computer takes a really long time to boot up, you may need to make some changes, okay? And if you're interested in seeing what kind of changes need to be made, then you should definitely post that as a question, okay? If the entire system is checked out and loaded properly, the process completes by displaying the start screen. And your computer system is now ready. Okay, so it's not perfect, okay? Nobody said the boot process was perfect. Sometimes you have problems, and these problems occur during the boot process. So here's some suggestions for solving a problem. If you've recently installed new software or hardware, try uninstalling it, okay? Think back like, oh no, I just installed whatever yesterday. Now my computer is having problems. If you can get to the point where you can uninstall it, try that first. You can always reinstall it. It's not a big deal, okay? If the problem no longer occurs when you reboot, then you'll know that was indeed the issue, and then you can try reinstalling that device or that software. What else? You can go into the last known good configuration of your computer. Again, this is referring to Windows, and that's sort of like going back to a point in time where everything worked fine on your computer. Okay, if you're like freaking out and desperate, then you can set it back to this last known good configuration. Keep in mind though, anything you've done since that last known good configuration date is going to be wiped off your machine. Okay. And then you can try refreshing your computer if you're having serious issues. Okay. But personally, I'm a big fan of turning it off. Leave it off for like 10 seconds, turn it back on. That's always my first method of choice when dealing with issues with actually any of my electronic devices. So, simple, but believe me, it works a majority of the time. All right. So sometimes during the boot process, BIOS skips a device, like a keyboard, or improperly identifies it. So your only indication that this problem has occurred is that the device won't respond after the system has been booted up. So for example, you turn on your machine, seems like it goes through the boot process, well, everything's good, and then it's time for you to log in. You try to type, nothing's happening. Okay. You can check, make sure your keyboard is attached properly. If it's plugged in, then you probably need to reboot. So force your computer to turn off and turn it back on. This time it's probably going to read the keyboard correctly, and you'll be able to type. Okay, and it could do this with any device, your mouse, keyboard, all different kinds of things. All right, so definitely always turn it off and on first. If the problem persists, then check your operating system's website for any sort of patches or software fixes that might resolve the issue. If there aren't any patches or the problem persists, then unfortunately you're probably going to want to get technical assistance. One bonus is that being an HU student, you can go to ITS and they will work on your computer for free up to a certain point anyway, so they might be able to help you out with some issues. Okay? I'll see you in the next section.